going in, just a couple quick reminders. My wife Shelley is back there at the book table. Let's put that book slide up if you would for me, Chris. I've written 4 books. My first one is The Grasshopper Myth, and that tells my story. I'm doing this because people often ask which book does what, and if I'm only buying which book, what do I want? And I'll tell you what they're for so you can get an idea. So The Grasshopper Myth is my first book. It's the one that kind of tells my story of being frustrated that I tried all of the church growth principles and it didn't make my church get big, even though I live in an area of giants, of huge churches and huge movements in Orange County, California, and how the Lord helped me to resolve that and to understand that a healthy small church is a wonderful thing. So if you know people who are discouraged in their ministry simply because of the size of their congregation and it doesn't seem to be growing the way they expect it to, that's a good book for them. The second book that I wrote was Small Church Essentials, and that was based on the first 5 years of traveling after writing the first book and hearing from small church pastors and discovering that there are certain ways that small churches function differently than big churches. Not that either is right or wrong, but I started discovering these principles from talking with people in almost every state and in countries all around the world. And I used the word essentials on the cover because what I put in the book are the principles that I discovered actually worked everywhere. There were some things that it turns out it works in America, but it didn't work when we went to Croatia. Or it works in California, but it didn't work in Georgia. Or it worked in New York State, but it didn't work in Costa Rica. And so the stuff that's in the book is the stuff that wherever I taught it, whatever the response was, it always works everywhere. So it appears to be the things that pretty much all small churches have in common. So it's very practical, very helpful tools that you can use in your church that are going to be different than the tools you're going to hear from big churches because they live in a different circle. So that's Small Church Essentials. 100 Days to a Healthier Church is the one that came out the first week of pandemic, a little over a year and a half ago. And it actually takes all of the lessons that we learned in bringing our church to health and strength in the 15 years, puts it into a very intense 100-day program. So if you are in a church where you think things are solid, but you know what, maybe we ought to kind of recalibrate and reestablish and see what the Lord really wants us to do for the next season, 100 Days to a Healthy Church is a really good way to do that. You read it through yourself. There's actually a wall chart that comes with it, big 2 by 3 foot wall chart that lays out the entire 100 days. So you can see them in the 4 main sections, in the weeks and on the days, so you can see the progress as you go. It's really a helpful tool, and it comes with a little journal as well. And then the most recent one, Church Recovery Guide, that's the shorter one. It's a smaller book that talks about finance. It talks about bringing our team back together again. It talks about all the issues coming out of a time of difficulty. So it was written specifically for the pandemic and the lockdowns, but it doesn't just apply to that. Any church that has been through a difficult season and needs to recover from it can be helped by the advice in that book. And if you buy the 3 on the left, you can get the 4th one for free. The Small Church Essentials also comes in audiobook. And the Grasshopper Myth, I have some Spanish copies and even a French copy. It's been translated into several languages, so we have that out there for you. So you buy the 3, you get the 1 free for $30. So you can see Shelley after for that. And also, just recently, as I mentioned earlier, we started a podcast called Can This Work in a Small Church? So wherever you listen to podcasts, it's on all of the podcast platforms. And every week we interview another church leader, but we do it from a small church perspective. And at the end of every podcast, we actually ask the question, so can this idea work in a small church? And most of the time, the answer is yes, if we do this. We've already done an interview with one person where at the end of it, we went, no, that can't work in a small church, but you can do this. So we actually ask that question and we take it seriously. So that's on all podcast platforms if you'd like to listen to that. So that gives you an idea of where we're going. So in this session, we're going to take a look at the next decade, what I'm calling a scouting report from boots on the ground pastors. As I mentioned last night, my first book is called The Grasshopper Myth, and the title of the book is based on Numbers 13. The 12 spies go into the land. 10 spies come back with the report, there were giants in the land, or the land consumes us. And then they use this line, we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. And this false report, because they saw the grasshopper in the mirror, because they saw a grasshopper in themselves. This false report was what won the day at the time, and they ended up in 40 years of wilderness wandering. But that report of the 10 was not the only report that was given that day. There was a report also given by Joshua and Caleb. And here's the interesting thing. When you actually read the text, what you discover is they did not disagree on any of the facts. they were sent in, and Moses gave them a checklist. He said, when you go in, check out the land. Are the cities walled and fortified? Is the land good? Are the trees small or big? Are the people large or small? There's a whole checklist that Moses gives them. And when they come back, they all agree on the data. So all 12 of them agreed on, they all saw the same thing. They all agreed on the information. They had the same information and they agreed on it, and they came to two different results. Because the 10 could not get the slave mentality out of their heads, and the other 2 were ready to act in faith. So we're going to do the minority report right now, because we're about to head into a land that we don't know, that we've never been into before. The future is going to be different from the past, and the differences have been accelerated and magnified, not caused by, but accelerated and magnified by the pandemic and all the situations that we're currently in. So what do? Well, let's take a look at a report based on faith about where we're going to be heading. And as I said earlier, we're going to do it in 4 segments. We're going to take a look at what's coming. I've got a couple things that I'm absolutely convinced I can tell you are coming, and that you're never going to have to pick up a rock to throw at me later because I got it wrong. But there's only a couple. Then I'm going to hedge my bets on the rest of them. What might be coming, what probably isn't coming, and what we can do about it. So let's take a look, first of all, what's coming. First thing that I absolutely can guarantee you that's coming is this: more change. More change is coming. I know I will never be proved wrong on this. Change was already in the air. It's been accelerated and amplified by COVID, both good and bad, but more change is coming. I believe more change is going to be coming in 2 very particular ways. First of all, we're going to see 2 to 5 years of fallout and shakeup after all of this finally does settle, followed by about 5 years of adjustment and assessment, looking back and going, what just happened to us? We've got 2 to 5 years of fallout and shakeup. What do I mean by fallout and shakeup? Right now, what we're experiencing, even though it continues to kind of come in waves at us, when this ends, it's going to be like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. If you've read the book or seen the movie, right? C.S. Lewis's great analogy of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. And he uses the phrase at the beginning of the book, in Narnia, it's always winter but never Christmas. Everything's frozen over. But they know that the spring is coming because there are cracks and there are little buds that are coming up. And so as they're traveling across Narnia, they come to a river that before they would have just walked across because it was covered with ice. And now there's a new danger. The thaw has brought a breaking of the ice, and it's actually a very hazardous river to cross now. So even a good change of winter turning to spring finally after all this time, of Aslan being on the move, the Christ character in the book, he's on his way, but even that thaw brings with it new dangers. So as we come out of this and we're looking ahead to, I don't want to hear the word COVID or a pandemic or lockdown anymore, there will be a day when we're going to stop talking about it, and it will bring new dangers. That's just the way of the world. We live in a broken world where bad things happen, okay? So we're going to have 2 to 5 years of fallout and shakeup. What is likely to happen during that season? Well, during the freeze, everybody is kind of locked into position. There's no question that we're going to have 2 to 5 years of more bankruptcies than we've ever seen before, more evictions than we've ever seen before, more job loss than we've ever seen before, more moving from town to town than we've ever seen, more pastoral resignations, more church closures, more divorces, domestic violence that will be exposed. Why? Because during the lockdown, we got people, it's kind of like when you're married. They say that the 2 most dangerous years for a marriage, the 2 years where divorce is most likely to occur, is the first year you're married and the first year after your last child leaves the nest. Why? Because if you got 2 people who are miserable with each other, they go, well, we're not going to get divorced while the kids are still here, but the moment they're out, I am done with you. First year after the last kid leaves the nest is the second highest year for divorce. So that's kind of what we've got right now. We got pastors in place. We've got bosses. We've got landlords who are going, I'm not going to kick you out of the apartment while this is happening. I'm not going to leave the church while this is happening. I'm not going to abandon the business while this is happening. But the moment this thing breaks, when the thaw begins, look out, folks. There's a flood coming. It's going to be a challenge. So we can either pretend it's not going to happen, or we can prepare for it and recognize this is coming. And as leaders in our communities and as in our churches, we don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but we can at least brace ourselves, right? If you've ever been at the beach, where I live right on the Pacific coast, and when you go into the water, first of all, it's freezing, But there's waves, it's a surf place. So if you go in and you're in the waves, kids who go in the first time, they just get knocked over, and you teach them how to brace themselves. Now the waves can come from different directions, but if you're standing in a proper stance, whichever direction that wave comes in, I'm ready to stand. I know how to brace myself. So let's brace ourselves, let's prepare, let's get ready. Some of the things we talked about last session. We don't know what's coming next. I cannot predict the future. I refuse to do so, even though it kind of sounds like I'm doing it now. I'm not, right? But we can be ready for it. So 2 to 5 years of fallout or shakeup are coming. Second thing that's coming in change is this. Restoring of relationships is going to be very hard. This last year and a half, relationships have fractured and broken that they never thought would fracture or break before, because we're dealing with issues that we never thought we'd be arguing over before. I didn't know I disagreed with you about masks because I've never owned one before. Right? This is a totally new subject matter, and we didn't realize where the fault lines were going to fall. We just didn't know. We just didn't realize it. And all kinds of other issues, right? So when this does finally come to an end, and people come out of there, as we talked about last night, their anger camp or their depression camp or their denial camp or whatever, right? When they kind of come out of those campsites and look around at other people blinking into the sunlight, we're going to have to figure out how to get along again. And it's going to be a challenge. And some of those relationships will be broken for good. Some will change, but will only be civil. And some will repair to the point where they're better than ever before because they've been through a difficult season and they've survived. And we, again, as leaders and pastors in our churches, need to help the members of our churches to do that. So more changes coming, the fallout, the shakeup, and restoring relationships. That's the only thing I'm going to predict as a certainty. The rest of it, let's take a look at what might be coming. First thing that might be coming is this. I believe we've probably got a move to small towns coming. I think it's already beginning. And here's why. During the pandemic, all of a sudden everybody had to go online, and a whole bunch of people realized they can work online permanently. And people who were living in a crowded, expensive city that they didn't like are realizing, I don't have to live in a crowded, expensive city that I don't like. I can do this from home, and my home can be some little town. And you know what? Us city folks have a really weird, twisted picture of what y'all's small towns are like. Our picture of your small town is not what your small town looks like. I know, because I've been in a lot recently, and I've gone, okay, this is very different. Us folks in big cities, we've got a picture of a small town where there's a little white chapel up on a hill, and people still bounce their balls in the street, and they've got their little stick that they across the picket fence as they go to school with their 2 books slung over their shoulder and in their bare feet half the day. And so us big city folks have weird pictures about your small towns. And they're all wrong. And here's what's going to happen. They're going to show up, and they're going to change your small town. And they're going to be changed by your small town. But the first thing that's going to hit them is this. It was 2017, the Wall Street Journal wrote an article, Rural America is the New Inner City. It's actually in the notes, so if you've got my notes, you'll be able to read that article. Rural America is the new inner city. And what the Wall Street Journal said correctly was this, that almost all of the problems that we have traditionally equated with the inner city is now the problems of the small town. Meth addiction, homelessness, teenage pregnancy, joblessness. And the difference is, in a big city, it's kind of happening to other people and maybe around me, but I don't know them. It affects my walk to work, and I don't like it, and it's unpleasant. But in a small town, it's people you know. And they know you. It affects you very, very personally. So big city folks are going to show up in your small town with an Andy Griffith idea of it. And Opie's nowhere to be found. Right? And so they're going to find challenges in their small town that they weren't expecting. And they're going to bring their big city problems with them. And their big city mortgage rates. And it's going to change your small town, and it's going to change my big city that they're leaving. So what do we have to do? We have to figure out how to adapt. As church and community leaders, we need to figure out how to welcome the people to our community who don't know Jesus, that we can reach out and help them know Jesus. and help them understand what it is like to live in our small town. We need to step up and be leaders in that situation. In my situation, we're going to have to figure out how to live with the exodus. I've got so many people lined up at the door of my church to leave California. I'm telling you, next couple of years, we are already bracing and preparing ourselves financially and relationally and with our teams and everything else. We know we're going to lose a swath of people. We lose them regularly, but in the next few years, we're going to lose a ton of them to your small towns. And it's going to be a challenge to us to lose them. It's going to be a challenge to you when they show up. So I don't have a lot of answers for what you to do except brace yourself. Know that it's coming so that at least it doesn't surprise you when it happens. And so that we can lead our congregations when it does. So move to small towns are probably coming. Secondly, smaller venues. I've got a friend named Mel McGowan. When I first came to my church 29 years ago, he and his wife and kids were at the church. I dedicated his kids. And at the time, he just worked for Disneyland because it's just 8 miles from our house. But he started his own architectural firm. And in the last 5 to 6 years, it's become one of the leading church building architectural firms in the country called Storyland Studios. And so Mel and I are friends, and so going through all this, Mel was one of the people that I checked with, because architecture is actually a leading indicator, because you have to plan so far in advance for what you're going to build, buying the land, what kind of thing you're going to build. So you talk to an architecture about what kinds of buildings they're anticipating building in the next 5 to 10 years. It'll give you an idea of the kind of things that are about to happen. It's a leading indicator of where we may be going. So I sat down with my friend Mel a couple of months ago, and I asked him about church architecture. I said, what are the biggest trends you're seeing in church architecture that might tell me something about where the church is going? And he said, number one, nobody's building massive venues anymore. Can't remember the last time we got a call for a church of 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, whatever. This idea of getting bigger and bigger buildings, gone. The churches that are growing the fastest are asking us to build multiple small facilities. Like this room is about as big as it gets in most of those situations, because they're understanding they want to do multiple facilities, multiple places in multiple ways. They want people to have the intimacy of the small group with a pastor on a stage, but they want to have the resources of the larger. And so that's what they're working towards. So they're going to be going into smaller venues, and God bless them, they think they know how to do it. And there's a whole bunch about it that they don't know because they haven't been in small churches in a long time. And there's a season where they're going to need our help to understand how to pastor a smaller group, even if that smaller group is actually a part of a larger congregation. Because for the people in that group, they only know the 75 people that are in the room with them. And in some situations, 20 or 30 people in the room with them. Even in a church of 2,000 or 3,000, they go to a small segment of that group, and that's their Sunday service. Except for maybe once a month or once a quarter, where everybody gets together and they rent some big hall in town and they all get together for some big worship night. Their experience in their mega church is 75 people. That's probably a big part of what's coming. I know some of that's coming because I'm actually getting calls from some of the larger ministries now. When I first started this ministry, I had 3 goals. 1 was to encourage small church pastors. 2 was to help put as many resources in our hands as possible. And 3, I wanted to mainstream this message about the value of small churches into the larger church leadership world, including big ministries. I want them to know we're here and that we're here to help and that we're here as a vital part of the body of Christ. Those first 2 things I can do by myself in my pajamas at home. I can type up stuff that encourages people and resources people. But I can't reach across to the big ministries unless they're reaching at least halfway back. And recently they have been. So next Thursday, for instance, we're starting a 4-part webinar with Saddleback. We were on Saddleback campus and we recorded the whole thing. Me and a friend of mine named Dale Sellers, who runs 95 Network, which is designed for the 95% of churches that aren't big. And we're doing a 4-part webinar, and we're only doing webinar because they can't do live events yet. Next summer, we're hoping to do regional events for small churches where Saddleback will finance it, where Saddleback will organize it, Saddleback will administrate it, and all of the content will be ours. Because they came to me and they said, we don't know how to do small well, and we know it matters. Can you please help us? And every step of the way, I've been very cautious. I've had people tell me they're going to swallow you whole. And all I can tell you so far is they have been generous, they have been kind, they have been helpful. And whenever they've been heading down a road that I go, no, that's not going to work for small churches, they backed off and said, tell us what to do instead. They are listening because they know the value is small. They're coming around to that. Compassion International, same thing, probably the 2nd largest non-denominational missions organization in the world next to World Vision, came to us recently for the same thing. We want to help small churches do missions better, but we don't know how to do small. We're a $500 million a year missions organization, and we don't know how to do small well. Can you help us? And I've worked it out with them. They now call me their small to mid-sized church ambassador for Compassion International. We just did a webinar with them about how to do missions better in a small church. We are going to be having a summit in January where I'm bringing 10 couples in who pastor small churches or who oversee small church ministries simply for the leaders of Compassion to listen to us as small church pastors about our needs, about our blessings, about how we can help them and what they can learn from us. They are going to sit and listen to 10 small church pastor couples for 3 days because they want to learn from us. So that's what's happening right now. So these are some leading indicators. Things are going to be getting smaller even while they're being done by some larger organizations. So this is a small church moment, and we need to be ready for it. The folks who come to your small town are going to come with big church expectations, but what we're going to need to do is give them small church excellence. And it's going to look different than their big church expectations. So move to small towns, smaller venues. Another thing that's probably coming is this. We're going to have some parallel lines, I believe, of two things. One, on one side, more isolation, and on the other side, more intentional relationships. We've talked about the isolation a bunch already, so we won't go over that again. But I do believe that we're going to have to help people who are coming out of their hibernation to understand how to do relationships better, especially the younger generations that don't know a difference from isolation on the one hand and engaged in mass and social media on the other hand. I've got a 6-year-old grandson and a 3-year-old granddaughter, and the pandemic is about all they know. That's all that's in their memory banks. Now, thankfully, we live near them, and they're constantly around family, and so they are in relationships. But we're doing that really intentionally now because my grandson, his entire kindergarten year, was watching his teacher on a screen. He only showed up in a classroom for his first day of first grade. But his entire kindergarten year, teacher on a screen, that's all he knows. Now, that isn't all he knows because we're around him, but we've done that really intentionally because of that. So we need to help people with that to overcome their isolation. Another parallel line that's coming is this: faith deconstruction and faith reconstruction. If you've been reading much of what's happening in the spiritual life of the nation recently, you've heard this phrase deconstruction a lot recently. People saying, I'm deconstructing my faith, I'm leaving the church or whatever. When I first heard the phrase deconstruction, I thought, well, that's just a fancy word for backsliding. That's all that is. And I discovered it's actually not the same. They end up in the same place, but it's not the same process. Backsliding is lazy generally. It's lazy. They just stop doing it. They give up. They're tired, whatever. They just don't pay attention. It's not purposeful. Backsliding or they just enjoying their sin too much and they feel guilty when they show up, whatever. Backsliding tends to be more lazy. Deconstruction is very active. Right? Take a look at, you can take a building down by an explosion or you can deconstruct the building. It takes a lot longer. You have to really think. If you've ever done demo, it's fun, but it's not as simple and easy as people think, right? Deconstruction is a challenge. So we've got people around us who are saying, I'm deconstructing my faith. If you haven't heard the word before, now that I've said it once, you'll hear it everywhere, right? It's one of those things where I never heard that word before and now it's everywhere. Deconstruction is going to be that for you. And what we've got is people who are looking around and they're seeing all of the confusion of the last couple of years especially, and all of different opinions politically and whatever else. And they're looking at it and going, well, if that's what Jesus is, I don't want it. If that's what Jesus is, I don't want it. And everybody's got their own opinion about it. But we got people who are saying, I'm going to leave the church that I was raised in, and I'm trying to figure out a new way forward. And here's the thing: you cannot deconstruct and end up nowhere. Right? If somebody says, I'm packing up my house to move, what's the first question you're going to ask them? Where are you moving to, right? We never have assumed, well, you're just going to not exist anymore. You're not just going to leave the house and go nowhere. You have to end up somewhere. That's just reality. So these people who are deconstructing their faith are going to have to reconstruct something. And if we as church leaders look at people deconstructing and just roll our eyes and go, oh, that's just backsliding, or oh, how stupid this is, or I can't believe it, or you just want to get away with your sin, don't you? If we criticize them or make fun of them, do you think we're going to be able to participate with them in reconstructing something? We will distance ourselves from their desire to reconstruct something. And I think some of them are going to deconstruct some of the the extra biblical structures and maybe find a place closer to Jesus that looks different, and I want to be a part of the process that helps them re-find Jesus again. And if it looks different, if it's in a coffee house instead of a church with pews, I don't care. If it ends up in a different place, as long as it's the real Jesus, that's all that matters. So if they're deconstructing this stuff around Jesus so they can keep Jesus, I want to be a part of that conversation. Or even if they do deconstruct and end up falling away from Jesus, I still want to be a light post in their life that when the prodigal finds himself lost, he knows he can come back to. So let's not mock them. It will be easy. It's not easy to understand them, but let's not mock them, make fun of them. Let's offer an ear that they can be heard as they deconstruct their faith, because they're going to have to reconstruct something. And if we're not there when they try to reconstruct something, the Muslims, the Buddhists, the atheists, the humanists, the secularists will be there. And they'll offer them a soft shoulder to cry on and a listening ear. And if all we've done is make fun of them or tell them all you want to do is sin, I can't believe what's the matter with you, they are not going to come to us to hear us. Our attitude is going to matter in that. Let's help them reconstruct. All right? Let's take a look at a couple things that probably aren't coming. First of all, I don't think we're likely to see catastrophic collapse. I'm already on record as saying we live in a broken world where bad things happen and something bad is coming, but I don't believe catastrophic collapse is coming. Here's why. I'm 61 years old. I've lived long enough to have seen a dozen or more impending collapses that fizzled out to nothing. I'm old enough to remember all of the panic around late great planet Earth in the 70s. I remember 88 reasons Jesus is going to return in 1988. Anybody old enough to remember that one when that came around? Yeah, that one. Y2K, any fans of Y2K in the house, right? That was the biggest non-event in history. Blood moons, right. All right, every couple years, some impending disaster comes in. It all looks legit, and it looks like it's going to happen. I'm not saying Jesus isn't coming. I'm not saying it's not closer than it's ever been. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying there's no reason to panic because I know where I'm going whatever happens. And if we start acting panicky, we're not going to look like we really have faith. Why are you worried if you think you're in good with Jesus? Right? So are bad things coming? Yes. Should we be prepared for them? Yes. Panic? No. No. We should never be people who have even a whiff of panic or worry about us. We should be prepared spiritually and financially and relationally and in every other way, but no panic. Let's not worry about the catastrophic collapse. If it does happen, then Jesus is going to take care of that, so I'm not going to worry about it. The other thing I believe it probably isn't coming is this, and again, it's a piece of bad news. A return to Christian America. Just recently, I believe it was Gallup, came out with their recent poll of church membership, and for the first time in the over 80 years that they've been polling church attendance in America has fallen below 50%. It is now 47%. When I heard that, living in California, my first response was, it's still that high? Because I got to tell you, where I live, there is no Sunday dinner rush. Never has been. I was born in Canada. I've lived all of my ministry life in California. My entire life has been lived in a post-Christian context. The idea that 40% church membership is higher than I can imagine would ever have been around me. In California, it may be single digits. I don't know what it is. In fact, we were recently in Alabama, and one of the guys speaking was, he does a lot of open-air evangelism, and he said, I was out in front of Walmart the other day, and I thought I was going to ask people, as they came out of Walmart, just random people coming out of Walmart, can you recite John 3:16 for me? And he looked to the crowd, and we were in Alabama, there's a bunch of pastors in Alabama, and he asked them, what percentage do you think could recite John 3:16 for me? And Shelley, my wife next to me, leaned over and said, what do you think, about 5%? I went, yeah, probably 5. He went, 35%. And the room gasped that it was that low. And we're looking at it going, 35% of people in Alabama still know John 3:16 randomly coming out of Walmart? Y'all are doing your job actually way better than you may think you're doing it, because that's pretty high. Right? So, I have never lived in a Christian culture. I have never gone to a restaurant and assumed that anybody at any other table was going to bow their head in grace before the meal. Ever. When they do, I look at it and go, oh, fellow believer in Christ over there. I have never assumed that the radio station or the new business in town or the store in town is going to share my Christian worldview. So when Hollywood does some terribly anti-Christian thing and you all gasp over it, I'm like, it's Hollywood. What do you expect? I live there. I know them. This is par for the course, folks. We're going to have to stop getting shocked by sin. Happy with it? No. Comfortable with it? Never. But that's the society we live in, and it's heading more in that direction. So we're not time travelers, but in some ways I am speaking to you from your future. This is where it's heading. I was not long ago speaking in North Carolina, and when one of the pastor's wives found out I was from California, she looked at me sincerely and looked at me and asked, how can you live in such an ungodly place? And some of you laughed a little bit. I stifled a laugh because she was in the room. Laughing when she's not in the room is appropriate. Laughing for me when she was in the room was not appropriate, so I didn't. And I understood where she was coming from, so I didn't want to laugh. But I looked at her and I said, have you ever seen any news stories about North Carolina? Oh, yeah. Have they ever been wrong? Oh, yeah, all the time. They never get it right. Same in California. Don't worry about the headline. It's not quite as bad as that. But let me tell you, yes, the left coast the wing nuts and fruits and all that. It is crazy. I'm not saying it's not. It's a weird place to live. But I said, have you ever heard of the missionary C.T. Studd? She hadn't. He was a missionary in the 1800s to India and a couple other places, and he had a bunch of he wrote a lot. One of his great quotes, and I'm going to mangle it a little. I can never remember it exactly, but it's pretty close to this. C.T. Studd said, some want to live within the sound of church and chapel bell. I want to run a rescue shop within a yard of hell. So I said to her, now, my beautiful home state of California is neither hell nor a yard from it. But if I believed that it was, isn't that where I'd want to live? Isn't that where I'd want to set up my rescue shop? And that's what we're doing. I got a rescue shop within a yard of hell. In my congregation, they're almost all first-generation Christians. I was at a conference recently in, I think it was Tennessee, here. And in the middle of the worship team, the worship leader changed the set. He just turned to them and turned back and started singing, God is so good. God is so good. Come on. God is so good. He's so good to me. If I did that in my home church, crickets. They know Jesus. They just weren't around when that song was popular. They're first generation. It's different. So we're going to have to change some of the expectations we have. When you're dealing with first generation Christians, it's different than people who are third, fourth, fifth generation Christians who have this Christian muscle memory. When I get up in front of my congregation, I have to assume total biblical ignorance. I can't say, well, we all know the story of David. They don't. Now, one of the wonderful things is when you go back to it and you start from the beginning, you even teach the long-term Christians something they thought they knew. We just recently did a whole series on the parables, and in the first session that I did, I talked about how these parables are stories that Jesus made up. And so there wasn't an actual Good Samaritan. There wasn't an actual prodigal son. He made up these stories to give us ideas. I had multiple long-term Christians come to me and go, I never knew that. I thought there was an actual Samaritan. Jesus just made the stories up. I didn't know that. Right? Certain basic assumptions so when you start with that, you can really be teaching everybody. We're going to have to shift our expectations. And we're going to have to speak differently to people who have, not only are they not Christians, but the people, we've got many youth in our church who come to our church against their parents' wishes. Like they go home and their parents are mad. You went to that stupid place again? That's what they're facing when they get home. So when pandemic was over and our church was open, our church came back and then some, because if you're in a place where people have been coming out of habit for generations and the habit breaks, some of them are going to go, oh, I don't have to do that anymore. I thought I had to. Nobody in California is feeling have to go to church. If you're going to church, it's because you really want to. And there's a shift that's coming that y'all are going to have to adapt to, that I'm having to adapt to. But for those who live in more of a Bible Belt place, the adaptation is going to be more of a challenge. The idea of a Christian America where you can assume that people around you share your Christian worldview, that is disappearing and fast. And this last 20 months has accelerated it by a decade. So the idea of how do we get everybody back? At a certain point, you're just going to have to go, the rest of them aren't coming back. How are we going to pastor with what we've got? And how do we reach out to the people that we've never had in this church before? We're going to have to shift our emphasis. It's going to have to change. It's just going to be different, okay? So what can we do about it? Let's go through a couple of things. First of all, we will need shepherding pastors more than ever. I mentioned this earlier, but let me do one little quick thing on this. A little while ago, I was listening to Andy Stanley's podcast. I still listen to Andy. He's very different than me, and I never met him, and every once in a while I just roll my eyes and go, he just doesn't get our context at all. But in a recent podcast, they were asking him about, what do we do post-trauma? And he said, we are going to need shepherding pastors now. And his co-host almost laughed to the point where Andy went, I see you laughing over there. Because he said, I am the least shepherding pastor ever. I'm a good entrepreneur. I'm a good leader. I'm terrible at shepherding. Like if I show up in the hospital, everybody thinks they're dead because that's when I show up. And he says, I do shepherding badly. I'm not a good pastoring pastor. He said that on his podcast. But he said, even if you do it badly, you have to do it when people are going through what they're going through now. So and that's not just a way for big church pastors. There are some small church pastors who don't feel like they're good hands-on shepherding pastors. Even if you do it badly, you have to do it now. People need your presence. We talked about that earlier. Here's an example out of the book of Job. Job is a challenge to get through. I love the first 2 chapters and the last 2 chapters of Job. The middle part, that is a grind. And in fact, I'm not even sure how to approach the middle part, because you read through the middle part and then you get to the end and God says, you were all wrong. So do I study it or not? I'm confused about what to do with the content of Job because God says it's not good. Right? It takes a different lens. Right? You can't just don't take a verse from the middle of Job and put it on a pillow because God said, no, don't do it. Right? It's a different book. But at the beginning of the book, Job has lost everything. We all know why. We know the story, right? Job 2:12 says this. His friends start to come to visit him, and it says this. When they saw him, his friends, at a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. 7 days and 7 nights in the presence of a suffering man without saying a word. Now, folks, that's some serious pastoring. That's some great friendship. We jump right to the next verse where they open their mouths and everything falls to pieces. But before they opened their mouths, they sat for 7 days and 7 nights with a hurting friend and said nothing because they saw how great his suffering was. That's what we need now. We need people who will sit with us, and we need to be those who will sit with others. So how do we start getting there? Let's do a few things the way that we can prepare for. We need some preparation through a few things. First of all, preparation through unity. We talked about this already, so I won't go over it long. We need to be united around the mission now more than ever, not at the cost of the truth, but around the truth. Let's know what we stand for and be united around that. Secondly, we need to be united around simplicity. Again, we already talked about that, so we won't belabor it, but simplicity. Millennials and younger are done with boomers like me and our busy calendars and our elaborate facilities. They want something simpler. They want something more relational. That doesn't mean they're all going to run back to the little white chapel, but I do believe that the upcoming spiritual revival is going to look different than it did before, and it's going to be a simpler thing. They're going to want to strip away all of the extras, and they're going to want to sit with Jesus, and we need to help them do that. It's going to look different than it did before. Next way we need to prepare is this: repentance. It's really easy to point our fingers. at the worldliness around us, and there's plenty of it to point at. But we in the church have some serious repentance to do. For what? Well, where does the list begin? From the high-profile scandals and collapses to our behavior online, to distancing ourselves from people because we're so busy, to who knows what it is. We've got a lot of things to repent for. We live in a world, I've been a pastor long enough to remember when I was first started as a pastor, if I was in a room full of non-believers and the question started, what do you do for a living? And I said I was a pastor. Immediately, I gained in respect in that room a little bit. Today, if I'm in a room with non-Christians and the question gets asked, what do you do for a living? I drop my head and go, oh no, I'm about to kill the conversation in this room. Because when they come around to me and I say I'm a pastor, immediately I lose trust in the room. Immediately I'm less trustworthy to them. Why? Because all they've read is the headlines. They don't know that the average pastor isn't driving 7 cars. They don't know that the average pastor loses more money than they gain, that they give more money than they take in. They don't know the hours that we put in. They don't know the prayer that we put in. They don't know the times we spend by people's hospital beds. They don't see that. They read the headlines. So I can't blame them because they're not there, but that's what happens. We are in a place where we have to really be seen as repenting for the wrongs that have been done, or simply the wrongs that have been committed by others in Christ's name, and not leave ourselves out of it, because none of us is perfect either. We've got to restore this. The first step is repentance, and it's repentance on the way to the next step, which is this: integrity. We have to work on our integrity. When you have lost trust, the only way to gain your integrity back is this: we have to do the right thing every time, for a long time, with no agenda. To gain people's trust back again. The moment I say I'm a pastor and I lose their trust, I realize I've got some work to do here. They have to see me doing the right thing every time, for a long time, with no agenda. And there is no shortcut to that. Once you lose trust, once your integrity is even perceived to have been lost, that's the only way back. We need to get back to living lives of simple integrity. Stop chasing after the biggest church. Stop chasing after the latest trends. Stop chasing after more numbers. Stop chasing, and find out, where has God put me, and how can I live with a life of integrity here that honors God and that others can see as an example of how to live a simple life of integrity that God can be honored by. Which leads us to the final one, and that's consistency. Consistency. A couple years ago, in the evening, just after dinner, we had a knock on our door. And that doesn't happen a lot in Orange County. We went to the door, and there was a young man standing there, and I didn't quite recognize him at first, and my wife did, and she went, ah, and I'm not going to use his real name because this is going on the internet, and the story I'm about to tell would hurt his family, so I'm not going to do that. I'll call him Justin for this story. She looked at him and went, oh, Justin. And then it clicked with me. This was a kid who had run around with our boys throughout the neighborhood 20 years before. And he was in our house all the time because his house was miserable and fighting and all kinds of things. And so our house was an oasis of peace for him. And we brought him to VBS and we brought him to Sunday school. It was the only time he ever went to church in his life, was when he went with our kids and our family. And then went off to college, and then he went off to join the military. And he came back, and here he was, after having served his term in the military. And he sat with us and talked for a while, and, hey, it's nice to see you, and we're talking to Justin, and how's he doing? And then just kind of like it was odd why he showed up, and what are you doing here? And he wasn't really all that forthcoming about why he was there. And then just as we're about to leave, he leans over to me and said, can I meet you in your office sometime soon at the church? I went, sure. So we set up an appointment. He came in the day or two later. And he was just nervous. He was nervous as can be. You could just see it in his face and his hands. And I couldn't get out of it why he'd come. He wouldn't tell me. Finally I said, Justin, you're here for a reason. Whatever it is, I'll listen. I love you. Just tell me. And he told me this story. He was in the army. And he was leading a caravan of Humvees through the desert in Iraq. And he knew that to get from point A to point B, they were going to have to go to a particular town that was filled with insurgents. It was a very, very dangerous place. And he was under command. He said, when you hit the border of that town, you do not divert from the route. You do not slow down. You do not stop, or everybody under your command will be killed. That's just how dangerous it is in that town. So he said, we got into that town. We're going full boat. We turn around a corner, and there in front of me, on one side there's a wall, and on the other side there's an IED, an explosive device buried into the ground. And in between it, they'd sat a little child. And I had to give the order in the lead car to keep driving. And he looked at me shaking with tears in his eyes, the little kid who'd run around our neighborhood with my boys. He said, God can't forgive that, can he? And I assured him of Jesus' love. And I held him as he just collapsed in my arms, this big, strong soldier who had never told the story to anybody. And I just held him for the longest time. And I prayed with him and sent him on his way. He promised he'd get in touch with me again. And a couple weeks later on Facebook, we read that he had died. And I thought, did I blow it? Did I make a mistake? Did he take his life? Because it was days until we heard what happened. He was too young to have died, and it turned out it was just a freak car accident. And as I realized he had not taken his life, and I recalled back, and the last prayer I prayed with him was a prayer to receive Christ into his heart. And the reason he came, I asked him when I left, why did you come to our house? He said, because I didn't know where to go. I've been wandering for months. I can't think straight. I can't see straight. I found myself in my old neighborhood. And he said, I drove by the house and I thought, I wonder if the Vaters are still there. Because he thought, if the Vaters are still there, I might be able to tell you. You're the only person I feel safe telling this to, because you were a safe house for me when my house wasn't safe. You brought me to church. You didn't judge me. You didn't condemn me. You just loved me as a little kid, and nobody else in the neighborhood did. And maybe if the Vaters are still there, I can tell them. And so he told me. That was, almost 20 years after he left. Now, I'm not telling you you can't leave where you are. But there is something about just saying, Lord, this is where I'm staying, whether it's geographically and certainly spiritually, certainly morally, certainly ethically. This is who I am. Everybody else may be deconstructing. I'm deconstructing nothing but anything that I might have attached to Jesus that shouldn't have been there already. You can go wherever you want. You can run around wherever you want. You can do whatever you want. Just like the prodigal who leaves, you can go wherever you want. I'm staying home because I know whom I have believed. And for me, the Lord also helped us to stay in a physical place. He didn't at first. We moved around a little bit, but he finally kept us there. And it was a simple life of integrity, a life of simplicity, and the consistency of him knowing where to find us. I'm not afraid of much, but here's what I'm afraid of. You know the story of the prodigal son? Of course you do. We stop that story right before we get to Jesus' main point of his story to his original audience. The big, the strings play in the background as they run through the field and the father and son hug each other. And that's where most of us end the story in our minds. But then Jesus got to the real lesson of the story for those who were listening. And then he goes, by the way, there was an older brother in the house, as he's looking at the Pharisees. And the older brother wasn't so happy when the younger brother showed up. And he looked at all the older brothers around him, and I'm not afraid of much, but here's what I'm afraid of. I'm the older brother. I told you earlier, I was born as my dad was preaching. I gave my life to Jesus when I was 6. I've never fallen away since then. I've been in church just about every Sunday in my life. I'm his older brother as it gets. I haven't left the Father's house. So I'm not afraid of much, but here's what I'm afraid of. I'm terrified that when the prodigal makes his way home, I won't be there with the Father to hug him. That's the only thing I'm afraid of. I don't want to put up any roadblock that stops me from being out there with the Father in the field looking for the prodigal every single day. For Justin, I was able to be that place. There was a spot in his life that he could rely on. It was only one spot in his life. He couldn't rely on his family. He couldn't rely on the army. He couldn't rely on his own understanding of his own forgivability. But there's this one place where maybe, if there's hope, that's the only place I know to go. And thank God he kept us there long enough so that when the prodigal turned the corner, he saw me in the field. And the Father and I hugged him together and welcomed him back home. So we look ahead, and the future looks kind of scary, and it's uncertain for sure. And there's a whole lot of things that are going to change. And some of the things that I've said today, the last 2 days, may have sounded unusual and weird and different, and it's just California, whatever. I don't care. Take what works for you so that you're in the field with the Father when the prodigal turns around and says, I got to find my way back home. That's what it's all about. That's what we're here for. It's going to look different in your context than it looks in mine. But we have to live lives of simplicity, of integrity, of honesty, of holiness, of praise, of worship, of hope, of faith. We need to live those simple lives of those simple principles. And whatever everybody else does, you just say, this is who I am, this is where I am. Like it or not, I'm not changing, but you're never going to be able to look at me and say he didn't do his everything to live for Jesus. That's my hope for you, for your church, for the prodigals who may have left or are about to leave. Hold a place so that they know you're next to the Father when they come back home. Thank you.